of course, James Sturm, who's it's a pleasure for us to have you here and to hear your lecture and afterwards hear your panel talk, I suppose. Yeah, it's a great honor that I have you here, that we have you here and can hear you talk about your work on marketing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. Just to give you a short impression, what you will hear during, well, the next about 60 to 70 or 80 minutes, is I will do a very, very short introduction about James Sturm for the very few people who haven't heard anything about him yet, so don't expect too much. And afterwards, James will tell something about his new book, Markttag, German translation. And that will take some time, because it's very interesting what he has to say about that. And afterwards we'll talk about that, and talk about the other things he did, and talk about a little bit of the Center for Cartoon Studies he's leading in Vermont. And afterwards, of course, we'll open up the discussion for you, so if you've got any questions, just be a little bit patient. You will get your chance to ask him anything you like, and perhaps he will also be able to answer it. So let's just see. James Sturm, that's the first publication of James Sturm work in Germany as far as I know. He got very famous with a comic book which was called Gollum's Mighty Swing, which was published in 2001 in the United States, but that of course wasn't his debut. He debuted, I guess, in the early 90s, worked together with Art Spiegelman on, well, I guess publishing Raw, but not drawing.
I was an intern.
Okay, an intern, Draw magazine, but of course that's some kind of recommendation, of course, for someone who's coming into comics. And well, afterwards he did things like the Serial Killers and things like that. And then he did something which was collected as the America Trilogy. And last part of the America Trilogy is the Gollum's Mighty Swing. And the first two parts, which are collected in this beautiful volume, is the Revival and Hundreds of Feet Below Daylight. Two stories which take place in the 19th century. The Revival very early in the 19th century, 100 Feet Below Daylight very late in the 19th century. One thing about, well, let's say, problems of faith, about the early settlers and their deep faith, their Christian faith. And there's a second volume about, well, kind of mining business, which doesn't work that well as the guys who were starting that thought of, and about a collection of, well, about the problems of getting rich, about getting money out of the mining business. But of course, this is just kind of subject which is underneath. It is a kind of portrait of the American society. There's one thing, well, let's talk about that later, it gets too long. Let's just say, James Sturm is one of the most proliferate artists at our time in America. And Market Day, which was published last year in the States and was just published here by Reproduct, was after some years of break when the Center for Cartoon Studies was established, a very, very great return of this artist. It's a fantastic book. It's the first one he did in color, and now we'll hear something about how it was done.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Also, thank you to America House for hosting and Reproduct for having me here, for coming out and moderating. Before I start my slideshow, I was an intern at Raw Magazine, and it was a very valuable internship because I was struggling to try to learn how to make graphic novels at a time when there weren't really many being done, and Art was serializing mouse in the pages of in the pages of Raw. So I would go, and they had photostat cameras instead of scanning, and I would go and take Art's artwork in and shoot it to prepare it for the publication. And I would pull out a page of mouse to shoot it, and underneath was like the drawing, the preliminaries drawing beneath that, and I'd look at that and pull that out, and then there was another draft beneath that, and I really started understanding the work that went in learning a systematic approach to making comics from that internship. So you know, they would knock on the door, "What are you doing in there? You're supposed to shoot 5 pages," and an hour later after reading drafts of Mouse. But we're not here to talk about Mouse, we're here to talk about me. So, and should we, is this good? Is this clear enough? People can see? Good. So I'll start talking with Market Day, and you know, one of the questions cartoonists get a lot is, you know, where do you get your ideas? Why do you choose the subjects that you choose? So I'm going to try to address that in regards to this book as much as I can. And what I find with pieces that I work on, they don't choose, you know, you don't choose them as much as they choose you. It takes many years to work on a book. And for me to be able to stick with something and focus on something for that long, it needs to engage me in many levels. I have to be attracted to the subject matter, the imagery, and then I also there has to be something that I'm figuring out personally about the work as well. For Market Day, when I trace back, try to unravel the influences, I've always been drawn to photography and documentary photography specifically. And these are drawings that came out of America in the 1930s for the most part. There was a program, the WPA photographers, that included people like Walker Evans and this photo by Dorothea Lange, Gordon Parks, Ben Shawn, among others. And during the Depression, they hired these photographers to give employment, and they sent them throughout the country. And they're beautiful photos, of course, very well composed, well developed, and they depict people who are better than their circumstances. And I love these photos for as much as the aesthetic reasons, but also for the historical narrative that they convey. And when I look at these photos, I see something hopeful, right? I look at photos with the knowledge of the history that came after. I see this photo, and I know that the civil rights was eventually passed in the United States. I know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, brought in the New Society, the New Deal, and there were public work programs, and even though maybe individually things didn't work out well, knowing the history, I'm allowed to indulge my optimism, so to speak. So at the same time that these photos were taken in Europe about the same time, and I was living in New York City at the time, and I remember I'd go to the Strand, a great bookstore, and I'd collect books by Roman Vishniac and Alter Katsune. If anybody wants to correct me on that, they're more than welcome. Pronunciation. And books of Yiddish postcards of Eastern European Jewish life before the Holocaust. And, also very beautiful photos. Also, people who are better than the circumstances they find themselves in, beggars, poor people. But instead of seeing these as hopeful images, I always saw them as tragic images for obvious reasons, because we know of the history of what happened in Eastern Europe to Jews. And this bothered me. It bothered me that I would look at these photos and only see victims. I would only see people that I assumed were murdered. And of course, individually, maybe not. Of course, none of them did. And I also, when looking at these photos, they hit me on another deep level as well, because I'd see family resemblances. I'd see a child's face or a crooked smile or the shape of a fingernail, and I'd recognize that in like my wife's cousin or a family member. That there'd be a quality, and that also kind of resonated with me deeply. So I knew artistically I wanted to do something. I wanted to shape these photos, and I wanted to kind of bring this world back to life. And this photo is this frozen moment in time. I wanted to unfreeze it, and I wanted to kind of take the tragic shadow away and invest this story with some type of dignity. And the way to approach this for me was to tell a story that reflects somebody's ambitions, their ups, their downs, their aspirations. So that was partially my goal in creating a book like Market Day. Here's some other, and a lot of these photos you'll actually find in the book. I use these as specific references for certain photos, which I'll be able to show you in a moment as well. And that's Roman Vishniac. And I would assume this is something that I when Market Day first came out in the United States as well, I was contacted by the woman who works at the International Photography Center, and she is working with the Roman Vishniak's estate. And they're launching a huge Roman Vishniak show. I think it's going to be this fall. And she heard me on a podcast or something talking about Market Day, and she was telling me about her project. That basically the photos that we know of Roman Vishniak's work is like 2% of his photos. The poor, the pious Jews really accounts for a small percentage, and he really photographed a whole sweeping scope of Jewish life. But in the 1970s, when Fiddler on the Roof came out in the United States, there was this nostalgia for the shtetl and this, the poor pious Jew, and this is, the type of photos that got much traction, and these are the books that sold. So it's going to be very interesting to kind of see this richer and more diverse portrait, and I personally, I can't wait to see that show as well. And this is a Yiddish postcard. This one as well, and these are images that also informed the Market Day. And I looked at a lot of photos, I looked at a lot of images when crafting Market Day, but I also see it also as a fantasy space as well, simplifying forms and just kind of part of me feels it's a place of memory as much as it is as something that really existed. With my historical fiction. In James Sturm's America, it was very important to me to make something historically plausible. The stories in James Sturm's America could have happened. In Market Day, there's things that I added and taken away. Hopefully, that they don't jar the reader, but I added them because for the purposes of the kind of a fairy tale of the story. And here's the Rug Weaver, which is a protagonist of my book. In all the historic fiction that I do, I always have to put myself into it, my own set of concerns, the questions that I'm asking myself, because ultimately the time you spent with a book is a time spent asking questions. And of course it just generates more questions, but it's a way of kind of articulating and discovering a certain aspect that you're trying to figure out. So Market Day is a day in the life of Mendelman and the Rug Weaver, and if I could have made him a cartoonist, I would have. He is somebody who is a craftsman, and he wants to, he sees the world as an artist sees the world. He sees the world, and he tries to translate it into his work. And he's not, I would call, a religious Jew by any stretch of the imagination. If he had any religion, it's the discipline of making art. And in fact, in the book at some point, he talks about being at his, sitting Shiva at his mother's funeral and wishing that he was back at the loom, because this is the way that he meditates. This is how he enters his sacred space. Cartooning for me has always been my tool to take on the world. It helps me understand how it fits together. It's taking all the visual impressions and then rearranging it in, putting it in little boxes, rearranging it in the page, and then somehow creating some greater meaning. And this is of course the fundamental value of art too, in some ways to find meaning. But once art does become a commodity, when you look at art to support yourself, the marketplace puts a value on your work. And the story of Market Day is that moment when an artist realizes that making art and making a living are no longer compatible. And this is a very scary, chilling moment for an artist. When you're in your 20s, it's not such a concern, right? You can not have health insurance, at least in the States. You can live on macaroni and cheese and sleep on the couch, but as you get older and you have maybe middle-class aspirations, or you become a family man or a family woman, you have to somehow figure out how to be true, honor yourself as an artist, but also deal with the practicalities of being an art, of living in this world. I'm going to talk a little bit about my approach to making comics as well. Oh, where did that come from? God will reveal himself through your work. There's a panel from my book. Okay. We were talking about Little Lulu right before. This is one of my favorite comics of all time, Little Lulu. It's a 1950s comic for kids that still holds up very well. And my approach to making comics is that you're really creating pictures that you read. And just like comics that are overly written, it's applied too much, doesn't let the imagination fill in as much. I too, I don't like my comics overdrawn. And I find so much of the illustrative fantasy comics, superhero comics, it gives me a headache. I can't look at it. I like my comics more deliberately designed, and the accumulation of these panels is kind of what gives them power. I don't want to linger on all the little details. I find that it's easier to get absorbed in these stories. And you could say, you know, I know people like, part of the reason people go to comics is the illustrative aspect of it. But I don't think more lines give a story more depth, not by any stretch of the imagination. And a lot of, for instance, John Stanley's work, you know, if you took away the color on this page, you have a really spare set of lines. There's not much, and yet, you know, this childhood world of Lulu and the strong personalities, and you know, really shine through. And here's a little bit of a passage, a couple pages from the book itself. And it's a scene where color and a little abstraction takes over, and it shows kind of how Mendelman, like many artists, kind of can lose themselves in the work. He's going to the market, and he has to leave before dawn, and the sun's about to come up, and he just is, you know, staring at the. You're always translating, you know. If you're a gag cartoonist, every conversation that you're in, every little funny thing that strikes you, you're thinking, how can I turn that into a gag, you know? When you're a cartoonist, you're always just kind of looking, you know, at the sky and saying, how would I translate that cloud into, you know, into line, or how would I depict that, you know, when I go to color in Photoshop. And here he's seeing the sunset, and he literally now starts seeing the sunset as some type of rug, and he's living in his head, in his imagination, as much as he's living, you know, in the physical world as well. This is a photo by Alter Katsune, and this is a little bit of my process that I go through. I really love, well, I loved pouring through these photo books for that, you know, over the few years I worked on Market Day. It was always a treat to, you know, before I would start drawing, just kind of leaf through it until I found the photo that I was looking for. And this is basically, you know, 3/4 of a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper, where I would do a very rough pencil sketch. And the pencil sketch would, you know, then get inked and then colored on the computer as well. In Market Day, too, I'll mention a little bit of my use of color. I knew I wanted this book to be color for a few reasons. One is I was looking at this pictorial history of lots, and there were color photos of as opposed to black and white photos. And most of the photos I showed you were black and white. And I need to scan some of those images for the slideshow. And it was somehow like black and white photos, it kind of sets it apart in the world of the past. You know, black and white movies are old movies, and they seem very, very dated. But when I saw the color photos, and they were from just the early 40s, there was this very jarring experience I had, because it kind of took it out of the past and moved it much closer to history, or to its contemporary times. So I knew at that point I wanted to do color. Knowing I wanted to do color, it really changed the way you approach the line drawing. Not as much cross-hatching, because I can create value with color as opposed to line. And once I have my book kind of laid out and I start, you know, I'm inking it. When I go to do the color, it's a single day in Mendelman's life. So it starts off before dawn and the sun comes up, and it ends again at night. And he has emotional arcs that he goes through throughout the day of hope and fear. And then there's the physical day of the sun coming up, the sun coming down. So the color was important for me to think of the color as another narrative device that could kind of pull the readers in. And I'd like to think that if you took out all the lines and you just looked at the color abstractly, it would also somehow tell a story as well. Just here are some images from the book. This is an artist named Raphael Sawyer. It was funny because at the signing today, somebody said, "Draw this Rabbi Sawyer." There's a character in the book, Rabbi Sawyer, who goes up to Mendelman and is very, very happy with Mendelman. And I named Rabbi Sawyer after Raphael Sawyer, who was a Eastern European Jew who came to America, I believe, and as a boy. He also had a brother who was also an artist. But I loved Raphael Sawyer's. He's a painter, and he worked from, I want to say late 30s into the 70s. He was a very prolific painter and printmaker. And his prints, what I really liked about them, they have this very reflective and hushed and somber quality to them. And I love looking at this, but I wouldn't want to do a comic in this style because I would find it too halting of a read to get through. But I was, how do I get that kind of reflective, somber mood? And again, the choosing of my palette is how I attempted to capture that. This is a Lionel Reese, another artist who I just discovered a book of his work, and he was also went around Eastern Europe and did these drawings. And again, you can see how I would do a drawing. Again, this is half of an 11 by 17, excuse me, an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and then the final drawing as well. And I have no problem tracing photos and borrowing, because I feel like once I go through many drafts of a drawing, it becomes mine somehow, and I'm putting it into a different context to serve the story. So I'm very happy. I don't feel I have to reinvent the wheel every time I start. If I'm going to do a story about a certain subject matter, I know some I was listening to those filmmakers who made True Grit, and they wouldn't see the original John Wayne True Grit. They just didn't even want to look at it. And I thought how interesting that choice was. I mean, it was a very good movie. I respect their choice, the Coen brothers. But I'm the opposite. Like I feel like I want to see what other people have done and look at their solutions. And I don't feel the need that I have to start from scratch. The other thing I'll mention about Market Day too, and it was originally conceived as a children's book. My publisher many years ago was thinking about doing a children's book line, and he emailed all of his cartoonists and said, "If you have an idea for a children's book, let me know." And I got that email, and I was traveling somewhere, and I was on the plane, and I don't know, that sounds like fun, and I wanted to tell the story about how important a single person can be to the life of an artist, how one patron, one publisher, can really sustain somebody creatively and give them a sense of themselves as an artist that allows them to persevere. Because it's difficult. It's difficult because oftentimes you don't have the monetary reward, you don't have the critical success, and for you to continue, it takes a lot. And if you stop, you give up seeing the world in a certain way, the way an artist sees the world, and that's in some ways, I feel, at least for me, it would be a tragedy, or a personal tragedy at least. So this was conceived as a children's book, and even now when I look at the book, I see that DNA with big spreads and 2 panels per page, and it's kind of paced like a children's book might be paced as well. And of course, with comics too, you're just not designing individual panels; you're designing pages. So the way the color works within an individual page and how it's put together is also carefully considered as well. This is where I deviated from the historical accuracy. In my story, in publishing, of course, when your book doesn't sell anymore and the publisher needs to unload it, it gets remaindered. And there's nothing sadder than seeing a book or a book of your friend on the remainder table. I don't know how many times I've walked by a remainder table and that's my friend Mila's book, and I'll buy like 5 of them for $1 just so I can give them away and give them a home so they're not like in this little remainder pile. It's it's a sad fact, and I don't think there were also Walmarts in 1903 Europe or whatever it was. So I had to invent what Walmart would look like. So I created this emporium, and there's this thing called the Vermont Salvage Company, which takes architectural remnants, and it's this huge old house that just goes on forever. And I took photos and just kind of created this from Vermont Salvage. And again, this was something that nobody has argued with me or brought it to my attention, so that's good. But that was kind of created out of whole cloth. And this is my slide that reminds me that it's time now for us to talk to one another. So you can be the water carrier, and I'll just be like the other guy, just whoo.
So thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
When I first got a glimpse of Markttag last year when it was published in the States, I was quite surprised that you changed your setting to a European setting after working so much with American history. So was it just the influence of these photos which you showed us which gave you the idea to change the continent?
Well, there was actually a couple things. Before, I mentioned I did this children's book idea in a book, and then I put it aside for a year. And there was just a drawing of Mendelman's head and the barest bone outline of what the book would be. And at the time, I was working on this very long comic about a graphic novel. I'd done several drafts of, I think it was up to 300 pages when I stopped. But it was it was following a group of art and design students over the course of their freshman year of college. And so I started this book, and I don't know how many people remember their freshman year of college, but surprisingly not many, because it's such a, it's the year you drink a lot and party and you're away from home for the first time, and especially at art school when you're trying to, here's your opportunity, you've left your high school and you have a chance to reinvent yourself. And I was very taken with this story, and I had taught at an art and design school for 4 years, so I was pulling my experience as a teacher, but also my own memories of going to university. And what happened while I was working on this was I actually started creating an actual art school. Not one on the page, but one in reality. So for the first year or so, as I was working on this, it was kind of feeding actually starting a school. But once students started coming to the school, and the school started gaining momentum, it was getting harder to, you really have to become very stubborn. I have to work on my comics now and steal those few hours, on weekends and on mornings and in the evenings after you put the kids to bed. And it was getting harder and harder to sit down and work on this story about cartoon students. I was sick of cartoon students. I was like, I've been with them all day. I want to go somewhere else, far away. And I was resisting drawing, and you shouldn't resist that. You should be pulled to it. So I threw this huge thing I've been working on overboard, and I was flipping through the sketchbook, and I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna tell something much smaller story and more personal. Well, I won't say it was more personal, but it was a story that I feel like I could finish in this lifetime, as opposed to this 300-page book that I was calculating. Oh God, if I do this many pages a day and this is my pace, I will finish in 2084. And it was too overwhelming. So I think that informed some of my jump to another continent and this other world, because it gave me an escape from the contemporary art school setting, contemporary America.
Was the original setting for the children's book, which you planned doing out of Markttag, was it also settled in Europe?
Yeah, it was settled. There was at one point where I considered doing it in an African market, for instance. I mean, I know I don't think there's anything thematically that's specifically Jewish about Markttag. I mean, that is the setting, but I think that could be almost any nationality about the idea of craftsmanship and trying to make a living and make art and reconcile these conflicting paths. So briefly I thought about doing it as like an African folktale type of thing, but then I was like, I already have all these great reference books and I want to stare at these for longer, so I kind of stuck with that because it resonated more for me given my own background.
There is a kind of continuity from the Golem's Mighty Swing getting to the Jewish culture in Europe of, well, similar time. I was quite surprised, I've got to say, because I was surprised the first time when I saw the Golem's Mighty Swing, you're changing to Jewish culture in America, which of course was very interesting for me because I didn't know too much about that, not about baseball and not about Jewish culture in America, and of course a lot about Jewish culture in Europe. But isn't there a risk that you are now, well, beheld for the guy with the Jewish themes in comic books and graphic novels?
It's really funny because for a while I was afraid I was going to be I did this Golem's Mighty Swing, and then I did a New Yorker cover with a baseball player on it. And the New Yorker magazine is like the big, you can do a cover of that and it's a big deal. And then it was a long story, but I was coerced into doing a story about Satchel Paige, an African-American pitcher. And I was like, boy, I'm going to be the baseball guy forever.
Okay.
And, but now I'm at an age where it's like, as long as I'm any guy, you know what I mean? Like, I don't care. It's like if people are interested in the work and the things I'm working on now, like I don't feel trapped by it at all. And, at least in the States, like, the Jews are the people of the book. They buy books. And I don't know. It's fine, and it seems like it has a receptive audience for it. So I don't feel it's like a calculated decision, and I don't feel like I'm a slave to that as well. But I do think sometimes when for those who don't know baseball, and I know Europeans are so intimate with baseball, but a batter walks up to home plate, and it's shaped like a little house, and the object of the game is to hit the ball, circle the bases, and return home, And this was the perfect metaphor for the wandering Jew. I mean, to return home, every year at the Passover table, next year in Jerusalem. So to have a barnstorming is a term for, kind of teams that aren't in a league. They just kind of go from little town to little town and play the local teams. So to have a wandering Jewish baseball team playing baseball seemed a very apt metaphor of next year in Jerusalem, returning home. And when I did Market Day, I often thought of some of these people at Market Day were probably the parents or grandparents of the baseball players in the Golem's Mighty Swing.
How much of the original story for the picture book survived in the graphic novel? Because it's a quite serious subject, of course.
Yeah, the picture book, I can't say that I really worked on it, on one flight. A flash of inspiration, and you write down kind of the bare bones. And then when I return to it, you go through the painful process of kind of fleshing it out. But I find when I have a kind of a focused theme, and even in my mind, just a destination or something that I'm trying to do, and of course it changes during the process, but it makes it a lot easier. I think I was talking to Michael about like this next book I'm doing. He indulged me very kindly as publishers can do. But I have this collection of incidents and these things I want to tackle and things I might want to do. But it's like until you have that theme and that story that you're trying to, a specific theme, you don't have anything to hang it on. And for me, my approach to the work is trying to find like what is the book about. And once I have that theme, then everything kind of hangs on that. And I think it's the same way like a gag cartoonist approaches, like, everyone's like with cartoon, where do you put the camera? The students will ask, like, what do you show? And I think when you know what the theme of your story is, or what that scene or you're trying to convey, then you ask the question, well, the camera that best illustrates this. And with the gag cartoonist, it's like, well, what tells the joke the best way? But in a graphic novel, which is obviously greater in scope than a gag comic, you really have to have some type of organizing principle to help you make those aesthetic decisions, or you would be lost. And I think that's going back to like, why I don't like the, some of the more busy, noisy comics, because, I mean, the theme of the book is, I'm trying so hard not to bore you. And it just seems like every panel is just changing camera angles and sizes and focus because they're so afraid they're going to lose the reader's attention.
You described the topic of Market Day a little bit as a metaphor for artistic work, something like it. An artist which struggles with his own profession and the difficulties of getting that to the public and things like that. And you said, of course, you couldn't choose a cartoonist because there wouldn't have been any cartoonists, I guess, in Poland or Eastern Europe at that time.
Well, there might have been cartoonists, but not in the kind of graphic novel, thoughtful, literary way that some of us approach our work. I know that sounded very pretentious, but what the hell. But yes, there weren't the type of cartoonist that had that mentality that that Mendelman has in the book.
And was the Rug Weaver the closest you could find to a cartoonist?
I'm sure you could have picked other type of craftsman, yeah. But I just the metaphor again of like trying to weave things together and make a singular design that has some purpose to it as well. Like there's a little incident in the book where the rabbi comes up and they had a conversation earlier about when does Sabbath begin, and it begins at sundown. Well, what's the exact moment of sundown? I mean, who's to say? So, he went back and created a carpet of dark purple and blacks. And the moment where you can't distinguish between the dark purple and the black, that is when Sabbath begins. So, trying to show his thoughtfulness in his approach to the work. And I think that's an old Jewish tale that I read somewhere that I, again, integrated shamelessly into the book as well.
What I found very interesting about the choice of a rug weaver was that there was a kind of topos in Eastern European and especially Eastern German history about the weavers, who were a special revolutionary class in the 19th century, who struggled, of course, with the mechanical looms and everything like it, which put them out of work. But there's a very famous poem by Heinrich Heine about the weavers of Silesia, and there is a theater piece of Gerhard Hauptmann which is called The Weaver. So it's really a topos in German revolutionary history, as the weaver who struggles with his life. And I thought about it, if you were aware of this.
I wasn't aware of it, and even like the even the allusions to the Industrial Revolution, that he's doing this in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, was very far from my mind when I did it. And I can see that, I think it's kind of one of these fortunate coincidences, because, and I say fortunate because if it adds resonance to a reader, then great, it's something else that they can take to it as well. But it certainly wasn't the intent. But I do think like comic books, it's a rug, it's like, it has a function and you don't think of it above and beyond that. And I think for comic books, I think for a lot of people, it's a comic book. And you don't think of it as having any aspirations beside to, tickle your funny bone or give you a hard-on or whatever, for some of these comics. But it's, so in that sense, there's a similarity too.
When you were talking about coloring the book and about your reasons for doing it in color, the first thing you did in color, I guess, or the first larger thing you did in color, I was surprised when I saw the pictures that you choose, that there was, of course, lots of colors in the foreground, but the background was still almost everywhere in gray shades. So you still have this black and white feeling in the background of your pictures.
Yeah, so part of the use of color there too is just to, every panel you want to prioritize somehow. Like, I find I want a reader to kind of focus and then move to another panel, and some things I want to pull in and some things I want to pull out. And when you're too even-handed with the color, you just, the thing flattens out a little bit. So the gray was more to kind of pull things up and pull things back. So it didn't buzz. I didn't want the feel of the book to feel like buzzy. I wanted it to feel like more like the Raphael Sawyer work that I showed, more somber, a little more reflective.
Is there a risk for the founder of an art school for cartooning art to publish? To publish his own comic books, because everyone is just looking at that as a kind of program for the school, as a kind of ideal way of cartooning?
I don't think there's a risk, although several times in talking about the book, what's been brought up is like the message of the book, not message, but people would say, you know, this is a very depressing about, you know, trying to make a living at work, and here you are trying to attract students to say this is a viable career. And first of all, like, I don't ever tell a student this is a viable career. Like you know, it's funny because in the States you have poetry programs and you have sculpture programs and English majors. I mean, thousands of English majors every year, and you know, how many professional poets are there? Like, you can count them on one hand, right, in the States. And I just see comics as another medium of the arts that should be given their own dignity and respect. And if you can, you know, if you want to study poetry or sculpture, why not comics too? I don't feel overly self-conscious. I feel any kind of like stance where I feel like I have to, I would hate to be in a position where I'm kind of a shill for the school. I feel, you know, I want to pursue my own muse wherever it goes, and you know, some days it might be, it might conflict with my role as a director of school, and at that point it'll be time for me to leave the teaching, you know. But in, you know, so far it's still compatible.
How do we have to imagine the program at the school? What's the curricula for the guys who are visiting?
Yeah, well, cartooning, it's funny, in the States there's like illustration programs, you can study illustration. And then sometimes they might offer like one class in cartooning in the illustration program. And I always thought that was very backwards. I always thought like illustration seems like a subset of cartooning. You know, it's like one of the many skills you have to figure out to cartoon. What's really wonderful about where I teach now, it's very integrated. So we have a wonderful faculty that includes people like Jason Lutz, who does the Comic Berlin, and Steve Bissett, who's worked with people like Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore. And we create a curriculum where it's very project-based, so everything you do, you have to make comics and publish them and print them. And it starts off like a boot camp, and we address certain concerns in each project, and everybody feels very burdened by the projects. And then by the end of the first year, they're doing independent anthologies and working together, and by the second year, they're working on their own thesis project. So we slowly kind of put them through paces so they start considering every aspect of the work. And what's nice about a small school is the curriculum is integrated. So I can give one, you know, instead of, in traditional art school in the States, you have, you know, a smorgasbord, 4 or 5 classes, and you're trying to do your finals, and okay, but if I really work hard in my design class, I won't be able to finish my video class, and you just have to, you're pick and choose. But in our program, you know, your final project is one final project, and if you're a cartoonist, then in the design class, you work on the design aspect of it. In the cartooning class, you go over the layouts. In the life drawing class, you can revisit figure drawing or experiment with tools or techniques. But it's all funneling into this singular project. So in that sense, it's very easy to coordinate with a very collegial faculty in a small school.
How many students do you have?
We accept 20 students a year.
And how many of them survive the boot camp months?
You know, what's interesting is our retention rate is like a model of art schools. Out of 20 students, maybe 1 drops out a year, if that much. I think the most has been 2 and sometimes none. And we're very careful. Most of our students are in their mid-20s, so some have an undergraduate degree. Some have been cartooning for a long time. And they come to a very small town, like 2,500 people, a small village. So you have to be focused because you can't have other concerns. And you have to really be committed to cartooning and be mature. And so we vet carefully. There's interviews and we have specific assignments that they have to do beforehand. And sometimes when we're not sure about somebody, they're on the fence, we'll ask them to redo something and see how they take it. And if they whine and cry and complain, goodbye, you know. Because it's a small community. And what's nice is, you know, I taught in an art school, and people were just too young and not ready. And if you had a class of 20 students, you were lucky if 3 or 4 were really ready. And the rest, you know, if you're a teacher, you are obligated to give them the best try, but it's very tiring. Whereas if it's like 20 people that are okay challenging one another and you know, they're teaching us as much as we're learning from them a lot of time in terms of drawing on, you know, different techniques and the technology, of course. So it really saves on the wear and tear by having older committed students. So we've been, you know, knock on wood, we've been good so far.
School started in 2005, I guess.
Yes, we opened our doors in 2005.
How was it received in this small town?
Well, you know, it was, I mean, there's a novelty to it, because it was a small Vermont down town that was being revitalized through comic books.
Wow.
So we get a lot of these like Airplane magazine articles, and the LA Times did an article about us, the Washington Post. Actually, after the LA Times article, we got like 3 or 4 producers call us to do a reality TV show in White River Junction. But I wouldn't even return those calls. That's nothing I would subject me, myself, and my students to. But there was a novelty, which was great because, you know, in the beginning, that's how people found out about us. You know, somebody's aunt read about us in Southwest Airline magazine or something. And then of course, once we started having students, and you know, Scott McCloud visited and blogged about us, and we have you know some of the most prestigious cartoonists in American cartoonists that come by regularly. And then at a certain point, it just takes on a life of its own, and people want to come and check it out. And it becomes like a little special mecca for cartoonists. So you know, we you know, every year we hope to get 20 students, and we, you know, are anywhere between 18 and 24. And so far, you know, again, we've been fortunate to do that. And it's a small operation, but it's satisfying. It's a lot of work for everybody, but it's also very satisfying because you don't have to deal with the bureaucracies of a larger institution. You can be very responsive to the students' needs. If you want to change something, there's not endless committees. There's not endless faculty meetings. I mean, we have good, productive meetings, collegial, and then, you know, we try not to waste people's time. And this is, of course, anyone who's taught in a university knows how rare this is, from my own experience as well.
I guess you're the first successful cartoonist who started an operation like this, started something like this.
No, not at all, actually. The School of Visual Arts in New York City was originally started by a cartoonist, Bern Hogarth.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yes, and
he was the founder of that.
He was a co-founder.
I see.
Yeah, with Silas Rhodes, I believe. And Joe Kubert has a school, Joe Kubert School.
Yeah.
And it's more superheroes and more that industry based. But Joe's still cartooning, and God bless him. And oftentimes we have an application, and I feel, you know, this student would do better at a place like Joe Kubert School, just because of his aesthetics and his goals as a cartoonist and his mentality towards the work. No better, no worse, but more, you know, I think it's more appropriate. And I've always, from what I've heard of Joe's school too, I've always respected that he doesn't like lazy people. He'll kick people out, you know. And I taught in an art school that if you have a pulse and your check clears, you are in. And very tiring for the faculty, but they want it to be the biggest school no matter what. And you know, that's a hard place to teach at, you know. So I admire when you know, whatever your aesthetic standard is, when you challenge students to meet that, and if they don't, you know.
Was the success of the Golem's Mighty Swing helpful in establishing the school?
You know, it's funny. I don't think it was as well. It was helpful in the sense that it brought me in contact with cartoonists that became my peers and friends. So, you know, my first European conventions and stuff was I traveled with Seth throughout Europe, and we became very close friends. So when it was time to put together in fact, Golem's book came out just as he did his book Vernacular Drawings from a sketchbook. And so many of those drawings look like White River Junction, Vermont. So when it was time to do the brochure, I was like, Seth, you got to see Vermont. You would love it, and it's so perfect. And you know, he came and we worked on this brochure together. So through kind of establishing me as a cartoonist, it helped a lot to be able to network with friends. But what was interesting in terms of like when it was time to raise money for the school, and a board member or friend would want to introduce me, no one, you know, I mean, literary comics in the States, same as anywhere. It's like a small subsection that are into it. But when someone said, oh, he did a cover for the New Yorker, well, that was, that's impressive, because everyone's heard of the New Yorker. And it doesn't matter that the covers of the New Yorker, I would think, and actually this is something Seth said to me, he's like, when he did his cover, I congratulated him for getting a cover on the New Yorker, and he's done subsequent ones since then. And he's like, yeah, but it's in the wrong end of the book. And I was like, what book? He's like, the collection of New Yorker covers. You're like, I want to be in the other end of the book, because these were the great years of the New Yorker when it was great, and now, it's not the same, Anyway, so, whatever, it wasn't my goal, it was almost an accident that I got a New Yorker cover, but still, I'm more pleased for the opportunities that it presented than the covers, as well.
Just let me ask, how did this accident happen? Because of course it's something to get
wasn't
a drawing on the cover of the New Yorker.
Yeah, well, I'm not quite I don't make a living as an illustrator. I do occasional illustrations. But when the year the Golem book came out, I went to the I think I was at the small press expo in Washington D.C. and the book won an award. And I think one of the people who was at the table was Françoise Mollet, who is the art editor of the New Yorker and also Art Spiegelman's wife. And so she saw me win the award, and we spoke, and I interned there, so we saw each other in passing in those days. I don't think she still knew who I was at this point. But all of a sudden, here I am winning an award, and everyone's talking about my book, and I said, if you ever, I'd love to do an illustration if there's ever an opportunity. And a year later, she said, a baseball cover, why don't you send in some sketches?
Oh, well,
and
yeah.
then, and then the rest, yeah.
In fact, I love the cover of the America trilogy, and just to show it a bit better to you.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I'm very disappointed with it, and I was very excited when there's going to be a French edition.
Yep.
And in fact, they're mailing me the proofs right now, but I got to redesign the cover, so I will...
Oh, you did?
Yes, but I'm glad you like it.
No, I love it, because I find it so brilliantly in the time flow, which it from starting with the dinosaurs and ending with 9/11.
Yeah.
I found that really funny, and of course placing you just in the foreground and then sketching everything which is happening there.
Yeah.
I found that a really brilliant idea.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you, and I don't think anyone's ever even noticed that before, but yes, there's little dinosaurs, and then here you see the plane about to crash into the World Trade Center, and there I am, looking from across the river with my dog Felix, who's passed away, sadly, since then. Well, it's again, I like the idea, and I like it conceptually, it just didn't come together for me as an image enough. In terms of, it was this attempt at watercolor before I could probably do a lot better job now, and what can I say,
Well, it's some years old, of course.
Yeah, but anyway, I got to do a do-over, and it's all these things, at a certain point, you kind of accept it and move on.
Let's take a little look about older work, older work. That is the revival, the first of these American stories, which is placed in 1801 in Kentucky, I guess, during a big congregation of at about 20,000 people or so, I guess. It was historically accurate, I guess. It really happened.
Yeah, there was a big revival. I was actually, I was doing I was researching a story about Johnny Appleseed. Who was an American folk hero, but he was based on the life of Johnny Chapman, and which was part of this longer story about Emanuel Swedenborg. Do you have people know who Emanuel Swedenborg is? Anybody? The Church of the New Jerusalem, and he was a Swiss scientist who had all these crazy visions, and started writing about them. And very influential, William Blake was a member of this church, and Helen Keller in America, and Johnny Appleseed. So I was researching this, and I started with Johnny Appleseed when I was in a library and going over old frontier journals. And any time there were so many mentions of this Cane Ridge revival, and it was everything seemed so unworldly. Like people, it seemed like a crazy scene. And I used to go and follow the Grateful Dead in the United States and see many shows, and it'd be like 4:30 in the morning, and people are dancing and singing and tripping and going crazy. And it really felt like a Grateful Dead concert, this scene. So I wanted to try to capture a little of this. And also I just moved to Seattle, which was a frontier town. It felt like a frontier town. And this was just as the internet was gaining momentum, you know? And the world, I mean, everyone was going to join hands and sing Kumbaya, and all the world's problems were going to solve, and everyone was going to become a millionaire. And it felt like that. My friends were, like, some of my friends were becoming millionaires. And at the same time, I was introduced to a woman who was a healer, who was, you know, abilities far beyond that of mortal men. And I was just trying to figure out this whole thing about faith and the limits of faith, and you know, and this is what this story was you know, was the saints, you know, trying.
And the story is about a couple who has just lost their little girl, and they are joining this congregation, this big meeting, because they hope that the child will be raised back to life. And I guess now exactly these are some of the disappointing moment for the mother, who said, well, Christ just revived my child, and well, of course it still is there, but the thing which is most interesting to me, and unfortunately you can't see it there, because what I found so interesting, and you've got to imagine that it's true, the child on this last panel raises the hand up, raises the hand, it is, well, it gets alive a little bit again.
Well, the mother's hand could have been pushing it from off panel.
Yes, of course she could, but
I don't know. I'll leave that.
I always wondered if that was a kind of hint that faith can do something to the dead.
I leave that to the reader.
Okay.
To decide. Yes.
And that's the other story, the middle story of the trilogy. 100 feet below daylight, sorry?
Yes, 100 feet below daylight, yes.
About this small mining city in, where's it placed?
In Idaho. I'm a fictional town, Solomon's Gulch, yes.
I was absolutely stunned by this way of graphic storytelling. It reminded me a little bit of Lind Ward and things like that.
Well, a lot of the reference I used were like illustrated magazines of the time, Collier's, Leslie's, of you know, artists that went out to the West and you know, did etchings and drawings. Or they would do drawings and then send them back that were made into etchings. Yeah, I mean, the revival was everyone looking to heaven for salvation, and in this story, everyone's looking straight down. It's the opposite. So instead of pursuing God for salvation, they were pursuing the almighty dollar and searching for gold. And
All these stories were published by Jordan Quarterly, which is still your publishing house until today. What was your relationship to this publisher?
Well, you know, the Revival was originally published as a pamphlet comic.
Oh, I see.
That I won a little award for, grant to self-publish. So the Revival was self-published. And then somehow Chris, I had written an article about comics for a Philadelphia Weekly newspaper. And the editor had mentioned that I was working on a book, and I didn't know I sent Chris the article, but on the back was the publisher's little note, and Chris was like, "Oh, I like the Revival. What are you working on?" And I said the Hundreds of Feet Below Daylight, and this is what I will always love about Drawing Quarterly and Chris as well. He said, "Well, I'd be interested in publishing Hundreds of Feet Below Daylight," and I said, "Well, you know, I just want to let you know."